we've worked on this for hours and we have drilled this technique and they just don't get it.
Hi everybody, so today we sit down with Alan Dunton, who is a PhD researcher in skill acquisition, particularly in sport. Alan has a background in ITF Taekwondo and has represented the Irish national team. So it's nice to sit down today and get a nice chat about skill acquisition, in particular how it relates to Taekwondo training. Alan is currently a coach with the Irish ladies basketball team. So today we will take a look at some topics regarding sparring, how to train sparring effectively, looking at ways how we can break down our training to be more efficient and more representative to what we are actually trying to achieve. So make sure and give this video a like, make sure and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and sit back and enjoy.
So how's things with yourselves? I've seen, I'm not on Instagram anymore, so I don't see as much. But when I was, I'd see quite a lot of content you guys have been producing. It was very, very nice stuff. Obviously, me and Richie, we've had a brief chat previously about some of this stuff. But I was a big fan. It was good to see Skillac making its way into the kind of Taekwondo circles the way that it has through you guys. So I was very interested, to be honest.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think that's where myself and Richie touched base, was going back to some chats that we'd have had, we say, from the Coach Ed courses and that side of it. And then Richie would have been one of the very few people that you'd actually see, because he was active on Instagram, and that was one of the things that with the East Cork Taekwondo side of things before, starting to see a lot of the principles that we might talk about on a basic level being implemented, and that was actually part of the genesis of where our ideas kind of came from, because it was, well, I'm kind of talking into a vacuum over here and not really seeing any output from it, you know, because even if people are doing great stuff, you don't always see it. And you know, okay, you get a certain amount of like feedback when you go to national squads, and you know, this that we've implemented national squads. But, you know, then when Richie started to kind of really put stuff out there on Instagram, I was like, okay, there's a bit more happening here. So we started chatting, and then one thing led to another, and we said, right, well, let's widen the conversation, you know?
Yeah.
I think the thing with it as well is that there's very little like examples and things like that in the combat sport world. Sure. It's a lot of field sport stuff and things like that. So I literally had to do a little bit of trial and error myself and just come up with some things, and you know, like that's kind of where it all came from, really. It's
that is the big thing. Yeah, because quite often you'll see it in a lot of these settings where they'll use team sport examples. So you'll get soccer, you'll get GA, you'll get a lot of team sports, and people will assume it's kind of a games-based approach to what's going on. Where thankfully, especially with, obviously it's been a long, long time since I've been involved in Taekwondo, especially from a competitive perspective. But that's where I was quite easy for me to understand that it's not just a game-based approach. It's very much, you can manipulate constraints for individuals, and also that one constraint means completely different things to completely different people. So I think that and I'll be curious to know your guys' thoughts on that. So if you look at, one, how you apply constraints, and two, how do you see them affect other people, and then how you kind of combat those things? Is that something you've experienced? Is it something that you kind of have an aha moment of, oh, well, I applied this as a constraint, and what I wanted to see is happening quite a lot here, but it's not working at all over here? And what your kind of experiences with that have been?
For me, anyway, particularly in like a sparring point of view, really, as you know, it will come down to people's different body types and people's abilities and things like that. So as you said, what works for one person probably won't work as effective for another person. So I think that's where it actually has been very beneficial for me, is in you can put a particular constraint out there and leave people just like explore that to their own like body type and their own, we say, their own style, their own, because whether they're like a bit more aggressive or whether they're more like, you know, a little bit shy in the ring or whatever, like for everybody they can take something. I think that's kind of actually been one of the biggest parts for me, where if you go and do traditional drills, we'd say, like it's a set drill for everybody. You know, there's not much variable in like how it's performed and ways you can come about it. So yeah, I think that's been one of the most important things for me that I've seen in it.
Yeah, and then I suppose from my perspective, like whenever you set a constraint, you're inviting the person to solve the problem in their own way, and sometimes their solution to the problem breaks the game that you've created by setting the constraint. And so
100%,
that's the nature of it. So what you do is you have to really very quickly let go as a coach of that element of like utter control of the design process from end to end, because there's variables in the middle that you don't control, and that's the whole point of it. That's the chaos of it. That's the nature of it. So what you're trying to do is kind of like twist a dial on the system somewhere that lets you get some reactions that are kind of shaping more in the direction of, you know, of a good solution to the problem. And the good solution to the problem might not be the one that you know that you're comfortable with, that feels like, for me, with my body type, my philosophy, my ideas around sparring, for example, I'm going to have a bias towards a certain kind of outcome or solution to the problem. Whereas, you know, you take someone else who has a different mindset and a different mentality and a different way of doing it, even as young as, you know, you take the kids at 6, 7, 8 years of age, you know, how the world seems to them and how the game seems to them. I can't put myself back, unfortunately, 30 plus years into that mindset and understand the game again from their perspective. So all we can do is kind of set the parameters of the game and twist those dials and let them find solutions that work for them in their context.
Yeah, and that's 100% where I've found it most interesting, because I've gone, when I've had time, I've gone back to do bits of coaching in Taekwondo with Ken, and it's been very interesting to see how those kids are very much different to where we would have been in that setting, or even the why they're at Taekwondo. Like for me, for a very long time, it was I wanted to compete, and then for other kids, it's just social. They want to enjoy what's going on. So even the socio-cultural impact of where an individual is coming from has an impact on how an affordance will show to them. Some people will see a kick coming towards them and they'll think, okay, I need to counter. Some people will think, I just want to avoid being hit. And it's very much and as you said earlier, it's the affordance. So if somebody is typically quick, or if somebody is typically heavy-handed, or somebody is typically relies on how they like to spar, each affordance would be quite different for them. So if you set up a game where you've got kids on one side who are restricted to only throwing side kicks, and you let the other set of kids then see what does that afford them and how would they like to counteract that in like its simplest form. What I've seen is, the example that you show will have a huge impact on how kids initially start that, because they'll typically just mirror what's going on. So if you have 2 kids come out and they'll demo it, you'll quite quickly see that kids will mirror it initially. So then you constrain it again to say, okay, well, now I want you to try giving me 5 different solutions to the problem of the psychic. And that's when that exploration starts to kick in that little bit more. And that's where you'll see those little bit of changes. So if somebody got quite long legs, they're going to use that because the affordance for them is to counteract with a kick. If somebody's quite quick at blitzing, or they're like to blitz, you'll see that that's what will come in for them. They'll start to use that little bit more often. And I think that's where, when you talk about switching the dial and leaving it open-ended, that's the beauty to something like the constraint-set approach, because it allows exploration way more than, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to work off blitzing from a side kick, or we're going to work off a turning kick counter to a side kick, if that makes sense. So that's where I enjoy it the most, and that's where I think that open aspect and just changing the dial, as you said, has a huge impact, and not taking over too much of what's going on in the session.
The more that I read up on these things, and I'm even reading a book at the moment about kind of like communication with coaches, but the more I read up on it, it seems to be the approach is like being more of a facilitator rather than somebody who's forcing your way on the kids and telling them this is the way. And I think that really, really comes through in this type of coaching. Like, you know, you're, as you just said, you're putting the problem out there for them to come up with ways. So you're facilitating it as such. You're not like you're not screaming and shouting, this is the way. It's not very set in that way like that. You're trying to lead them to a place where they can kind of come up with the answers themselves, because I think that's also going to be something that they'll be able to hold on to a little bit more. As if you tell somebody, obviously, like, okay, they understand, but when they are part of it themselves, it obviously resonates much more with them. Like,
there's ownership.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Big time, yeah. And a really interesting analogy I've seen used for that a lot recently is the idea of a gardener. A gardener doesn't physically grow tomatoes or whatever it may be. They simply create an environment for the tomato to grow. And if you take that as a coaching aspect, you just want to create an environment where exploration and problem solving is what is happening. If you can create problem solvers, you're going to create somebody who in life, not just in a martial arts setting, is going to be able to deal with those problems. And we had Sarah Keller on our webinar, which you had tuned into, I think, Richie, on Friday.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting, is she talked about just creating chaos for them, but chaos that was like underpinned by psychological safety. So you create a platform of, we're allowed to make mistakes, and we're going to celebrate mistakes, and you're going to try things. But it's very much a case of, when you create an environment, and that's for me what it all comes back to, you create an environment where exploration, chaos, like in a sparring session in competition, is present, then that's where you're going to start to see these things evolve way more effectively over time. It's not faster, because it's never really faster. This aspect is always a slower process, which is why I think people find it very difficult to go to, because you have to be able to step back and say, okay, this will take time. You're not going to create problem solvers in a session in an evening. It takes them a little bit longer, but you're looking then at a learning effect rather than a practice effect. And like, if you look at a lot of the research, and I suppose you'll have definitely come across it with your backgrounds, is on contextual interference and how we design sessions, and that I can get you to drill something over and over again, and by the end of the session, you'll probably be pretty good at it. But if we come back next week, what's your base level going to be like on that? Whereas if I create a session where you've got a ton of contextual interference, which means that I've got 7 different techniques, you're trying to solve 7 different problems. At the end of that session, you may not get it, but your baseline at the next session is going to be a little bit higher than it would have been, because you are going through a process of problem solving rather than just, this is what I do, and I do it over and over and over again in this very remote, almost robotic setting. But then when you're presented with something different, that robotic performance that you had no longer works. So you're in the case of, okay, well, what do I do now? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of giving them the ability to continuously problem solve rather than giving them a technique and then saying, okay, you're going to have to use this in a world that we have not exposed you to yet.
I think
that makes sense.
And it's a long time for me since I started experimenting with this, and it's probably 11, 12 years, but and because you don't have worked examples to go from, it's almost like learning in the same manner. You're kind of you're setting a constraint for yourself and you're working around it. But for me, as witnessing it from the coach's point of view, 10, 12 years ago, my students knew a lot more skills and could perform a lot less of them effectively. Because what you were doing is you're filling time and say, okay, well, we've already taught sidekick. We know how sidekick works, so we're going to drill sidekick. So then as you start looking for novelty, you'll start looking for, well, we'll have a stepping forward, shift back before the sidekick. Doesn't matter, but it adds some complexity for some reason. It doesn't fit into the game necessarily, but it's complexity, it's challenging rhythm or footwork or something else. And then you just start to invent ever more complex drills and activities that do a sidekick in them, because you want to keep practicing sidekick. Whereas once you introduce that element of chaos, those extra levels of variability and contextual interference, the same sidekick is never again the same sidekick. Each time you do it, you train it, you test it, you introduce a slightly different constraint, you allow a different affordance for somebody else. It changes it completely. And it feels new again, in the same way as you walk out onto a pitch and you're playing, keep away with 3 versus 2, or piggy in the middle or something like that. The game doesn't ever need to change to be interesting again, because you'll never play the same game twice.
Yeah, and it's that concept of repetition without repetition. Have you come across that as a term? Yeah. So it's very much we're doing the same thing, but we're doing it different every time I do it, because we're never going to have the opportunity to replicate it twice. It's almost, you could go through your entire competitive career and you will never throw the same side kick, because the environment and the context will never be the exact same.
I think the best example actually that we have of that is a weird one. It goes back to your time almost, Alan, you might remember watching the Worlds in 2007 in Canada, and the constraints changed for everybody in as a world. They all changed because the mats were slippy, and it was just a simple shipping things. Like the mats, they ship with a water resistant coating on them that makes it slippy, and you have to seriously scrub them or use them to break that down. So you have 700 competitors or whatever it is arrive over to university in Canada, and all of a sudden nothing that they've done in their training has prepared them for the fact that my footing isn't solid underfoot. I remember watching Hong trying to blitz and literally just face planting and thinking, like, this is a guy who can really fight, but like, what can he do here? And you had people like who were simpler fighters, who could adapt to the scenario better, not because they prepared better for it, but just because their style was more conducive to fighting on those mats. They could do it. They could get over it. John Moffat went, you know what, this doesn't make any difference to me. This is fine, thanks. You had some people won their only world championships in that year, but you flip that around, and if we have a session late in the evening on a winter's day where there's no heating on, the condensation drops, the mats get a little slippy, all of a sudden you end up with an environmental constraint that changes everything about how you spar, what techniques are valid, what can be used, what evasive strategies work, what the dominant go-to is in terms of getting control in the match or a feeling of control in the match. Everything changes just because of a very slight fluctuation in the environmental constraint. And it's like, once you start to acknowledge that that's a real thing, you then start to have to acknowledge that, what if the constraint isn't environmental? It's psychological, it's ability, it's a range of techniques, it's a position, it's the game state, and you start recognizing how much those little manipulations change to make the game completely new again. It's very hard to argue against it.
And that's fascinating, because when you look at those manipulations, you talk about say fighting styles, and you would have fighters who would be very much counter fighters, you have fighters who would very much like to press and create pressure, who like to take the center of the ring and dictate. When they're faced with a situation that is new to them, if they haven't been in that situation before, so you say a counter fighter who has got 30 seconds left in a semi-final or a final of a Europeans or World Championships, now has to go and attack. They've never been put in that situation before. Going and being the person who tries to dictate the pressure and who attacks, it's going to be completely new to them, and it's something that they'll just find that they can't do. They're waiting for somebody to attack them so they can throw what they're almost comfortable throwing, and it's just something that will never happen for them because they've never been exposed to that. So you look at the match, you look at how you manipulate sessions to create context around what is potentially needed in the session, and that those examples are the perfect examples of why adding those things for me are key.
Adrian, that kind of goes back to a question that we were talking about that you had yesterday about the whole idea of having a base understanding. Do you want to go through that?
Well, I suppose that, one of the kind of the almost throwback questions that we had was like, well, from, if we were to go back to when any of us started and, take Alan, how would you classify the skill acquisition strategies that are present in a typical Taekwondo class of, not even say today as you've experienced if you went back to Turner's Cross right now, but if you take a step back 5-10 years ago, what does that look like? So just to kind of set a picture for the baseline we're moving from.
Yeah, very different. I think it's funny because I think quite often your experience as an athlete will shape how you coach for a period of time until you have gone to explore what coaching really is. And it's those people who actually are like, I want to be a coach. Will often differentiate in that. Like you look at the example you guys have given yourselves of how you've changed your training over time. But yeah, it was very much different. We did and I assume it's the same for you guys, even if you look at the international meetups that we would have had, or even squad training, a lot of pad work, definitely a push towards more context where we would fatigue and see how we performed under fatigue and stuff like that. But the big thing, and I know, Richie, you touched on it, is the amount of pad work that we did where it was predetermined what was going to happen. Was the percentage of that versus percentage of unpredictability, for me, was like almost should have been flipped, whereas it would have been 75% pad work and then you'd finish with some sparring at the end. Or depending on what you do, you would have a set number of drills you would go through. So we're working today, as you said, on psychic. So we're going to work psychic through a number of different scenarios, and then we're going to go into sparring. And even at that, if you create a session, it's funny for me, when I look at it now, I think, why did we not just spar to start with and then see what came out of sparring? And then, okay, so this is what we're seeing tonight. What's happening for you? Okay, this is happening. Okay, well, how do you want to refine our training to come back to working on that? And then you'd look at what are the key things we need within that session. So for me, there was a distinct, maybe not lack of, but not enough perception action coupling. So sparring for me is all about the interaction, what one person feeds to the other. And that wouldn't have been present for like 75% of the drills that I would have been exposed to on all settings from my days earlier, and that before I was in Turner's Cross and all the way through to squads. I think it was 75% kind of predetermined work and then 25% free exploration, rather than the other way around, which, well, to be honest, I think it should be 100% perception action, but how you manipulate that to make sure that you're not killing everybody in the session is kind of key. So yeah, I think I think that would be the standout for me. But I'm curious as to even how you guys have maybe evolved your training in that same question, or is that something that comes to mind for you guys?
Yeah, I only spoke about this with another guy from the States there recently about the whole idea of pad work and perception action coupling and things like that. And it came up, you know, the whole idea of like false distance and like inauthentic like timing and stuff like that as a result. So when you think about it, like when somebody's holding pads for you and things like that, the reactions and the perception that you're perceiving actually isn't the real things you're going to perceive in an actual bout at times, because like the timing and the rhythm and almost like pretty much everything really, the perception wise, is inauthentic and it's not really true. And I think that really comes down to one side being almost like switched off, whereas I think that having two active sides gives a lot more in terms of like the representation. And luckily for us, because it's semi-contact, we can actually almost like go to a sparring setting much more often. Whereas I think people think, okay, we have to do lots of pad work, and that comes from like boxing and MMA because they're full contact sports. But luckily for us, we don't have to worry so much about like heavy injuries and heavy knocks and things like that, because obviously it's not as heavy duty on the contact. So I think that's actually like a very, very good opportunity for us to actually make it realistic and representative much more often.
The pad work is, you know, when we introduce the pads and we think about the kids again, what you're doing really is you're introducing an abstraction that is something else that you then have to understand on top of the game. So you don't understand the game yet because you're a beginner. Yeah. But in trying to learn the game, you're also having to learn this abstraction of the game, which is what we do with pads. So you know, you're teaching them not just, instead of trying to create an environment where a person learns how to spar, you're creating an environment where you have to teach them how to pretend to spar while holding a pad.
Yeah. You're giving them that psychological safety, which is the key thing here. And it's very interesting you say that, because when I think of these things, what I always come back to is, well, what are you training the person for? When you look at gradings and assessments, pads are very much a part of that. Where you will be assessed on your ability to hit pads. I'm not sure if it's changed significantly since I've last done grading, but so I think quite often pad work is an element of a grading. And if you've got somebody who's going to learn how to take part in a sport like Taekwondo, but not necessarily compete at a higher level, then yeah, pads 100%. Give them an environment where they feel comfortable and safe to work, because they're there for an element of enjoyment and it's social for them. When you look at people who are pushing for squads and pushing to compete, at an European and world level, that's where that conversation changes. So I think you very much have to adapt to the scale of who you're working with. If you're working with kids and you still want them to be competitive in competitions, well, then yeah, still use pads, because as you're saying, you're getting them comfortable in a setting where not everything is being punched or kicked. Like quite often those kids, if they come in, their first experience is being punched in the face, even though it's semi-contact, it's not a nice experience for them. And you haven't given them that underpinning of psychological safety to be able to explore. So that's where
I'm laughing to myself that there's no comfortable way to get punched in the face.
No, I think you do realize after a while that you're not middle class, and it's a little bit more comfortable moving forward.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a big thing for me on that.
I think you've come up that element of the safety, but like jumping from that, I think one of the things that you have to balance carefully as a coach is the element of stress. So it's along the lines of creating enough chaos, but basing that on the familiar ground of the level of competence that the person has. So that the level of challenge that you set within the exercise is based on where they're coming from, what's an appropriate level of challenge, and then being able to specifically tailor. So there might be a broad constraint that you've set for the group, but that you might come back and manipulate and adjust it for individuals within the group, and increasing the challenge for some, reducing the challenge for others to allow it to happen within. I said, there's that lovely slide that everybody uses, which is, well, here's your comfort zone and this is where the learning happens kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, sure. But like, if you're so far outside of your comfort zone that you're overwhelmed by the emotion of it and the challenge of it, then no learning happens that way either. So for us, that's where, or for me, I would say that as part of the evolution, going from where, we did an awful lot of pad drill tends to be on the point where it's either like it's challenging for a while, but when it's not challenging, it's boring. And when it gets boring, there's no learning happening. When it's too challenging and then varying it is very difficult. It takes an awful lot of effort to vary it, where with a little bit of cop on and, human intelligence between the people who are involved in it, varying, an interaction between people where it's sparring or it is a sparring round with constraints set. It's very easy to make the smaller adjustments to the constraints to allow both people to have an equal, or a somewhat equal opportunity of experiencing success. Yeah,
and that's the key thing, because you look at theories of motor learning, and you look at you could even come back to the individual. I think if you look at the optimal theory, they take a massive amount of their focus is on motivation and external focus and how those things affect the overall goal. If you've got, as you said, you manipulate your constraint broadly and then you manipulate it individually based on the person, because you'll know yourself that the more you know about the individual, the more appropriately you're going to be able to apply a constraint to them to see what comes out for that particular person. You'll have numerous amounts of dominances for people who will only like to fight on one side. Like I used to only ever fight with like one leg and maybe two hands, like rarely. And I was like, yeah, I like this, so I'm going to keep doing this. And anytime I'd be told, oh, well, you're only allowed to fight off one side today, it was like, okay, this is really challenging and this is very difficult, but I'm getting better. But even then, you look at that, how often would I have carried that over to an intense pressure situation? And it probably might not have been all that often. So you kind of have to, and that's where the kind of next level of the conversation comes from me. I'm curious as to what you guys kind of maybe do to get to this. But when you look at the higher level, the high performing athletes, how do you, one, get beyond that point of boredom that you mentioned? So for high level athletes in your squad setting, sparring for them won't always give them that emotive sensation or that stress or anxiety that they'll experience in competition, because they've been doing it for years. They're very experienced. They're very comfortable in that space. So how do you create uncomfort for those guys? And is there something that you've done in that setting, or is there something that you think, Jesus, well, I haven't thought about that. How do we develop on that? Because I've been quite lucky to be surrounded by people who have used consequences and not negative, not punishment, but consequences in terms of how do we emote a feeling or a sense of anxiety that they'll experience a competition. So I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts on that one, and then how you're going to go from there.
That's kind of like the one, Adrian, that we were kind of talking about and experimenting at squads recently with the idea of if somebody lands a particular technique, then the defense for the other side gets switched off for maybe like 10 seconds or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose even before we jump into the examples, Richie, like most of what we're trying to do, we started top down, because it was easier to figure things out from the experience level. So where people were already quite good at sparring, they'd already dealt with an awful lot of it and they understood the game quite well. So coming from a point of understanding what the whole game looks like, it was easier to introduce constraints to do just as you said, which is to raise the level of anxiety, challenge, make it more authentic, and also to mimic different types of opponents. So like it was easy enough to do it from that point of view, and then to take the kind of the more general principles back down and do it at a club level. But yeah, what Richie was saying about there was one of the ones that we've done more recently, which is trying to find situations where we're wanting to bias towards a particular type of score or shot in order to kind of bring it out of people who don't usually throw it. Because as you say, look, if you happen to be right leg dominant, you're not going to bring the left in there unless you absolutely have to. If you're not flexible, you're not going to attempt a headshot. If you're, if your stance doesn't really permit it because you're more forward or full facing, or at least kind of forward facing, you're not going to go to back kicks and reverse turning kicks. They're not going to be there. So we started introducing little elements there to kind of encourage people to add on a shot or build a shot into a combination, knowing that, well, they're not going to go directly to this shot and get any success out of it. So they're going to have to build it into a combination. They're going to have to lead it or position their opponent. They're going to have to set up a situation in the ring for this to work. So for example, you want to kick someone in the head with a back leg downward kick, you're going to have to get them moving in the right way or preempt that with a shot. But the reward for it was, for example, hey, if you land that, their hands are taken away for 10 seconds and the rest of the people around the ring count them down. So once those hands are gone, all of a sudden it creates a whole other situation. Or we had on the, depending on what we're calling it at the moment, the circle of death, circle of trust, whatever it happened to be. But it's all it really is you'd have one person staying in and every 20 seconds there's a new person coming in to add on the pressure. But we were, or every 30 seconds, whatever it happened to be. But we were allowing people the opportunity, if they scored a headshot, to end that particular round of 30 seconds early. So because you're going to be staying in for 4.5 minutes under those conditions, knowing that, hey, if I can actually engineer and score a headshot, I get to chill out and be a bit more recovered, and that sets me up well for the later part of the match. Allows us to create some psychological conditions that are really preferential. So we have the idea that, well, getting a headshot does actually buy you some leeway in the match, in real terms as well.
100%, yeah.
You can take the foot off. The pressure isn't on you to maintain parity when you've just gone 3 points clear, for example. And, you're now having to do what you do in chess and think 2 or 3 movements ahead in terms of the reaction, because scoring a headshot involves positioning the other person or drawing them onto a shot or something. So you're not, even under the stress of being 4 or 5 rounds in, to a high intensity match, you're still trying to solve a problem. So the brain is still active. Yeah. And so we're avoiding that situation of people falling into a routine of, I do what I always do. This is a handy opponent. This is a tough opponent. Here I turtle. Here I go nuts, and I, hand someone my phone for the highlight reel. So I suppose those would be some examples. Richie, do you wanna?
And there's a load of gold in that I want to jump back to in a while. So that's good.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you also need to be very careful of. Sometimes I find that there can be some unintended consequences come from particular things like that. So even from the idea of having the idea of a smaller space and taking away certain techniques, you'll notice that people will naturally change their stances and things like that as well. So they'll go from the side on kicking dominant type of stance to a more forward facing punching approach. And it's interesting because chances are the skills that they're developing there in the stance, we say like the full facing stance, they're not going to directly translate them when they go into their normal stance to free spar as such. So that's actually something that I've noticed that kind of props up a little bit as well, especially like when we do, in my club particularly, if we do like hand particular like constraints where we're trying to develop some punching sequences and get people a bit more comfortable with hands and things, they will naturally resort to that more full facing stance.
Yeah.
But then that doesn't translate because you need to also keep the legs in there with that. So I think it's just the idea of getting that balance between constraining for something to happen, but also not taking away the big picture of how it needs to be as such, like, you know.
Yeah, 100%. And that's one of the biggest things when you look at a constraints-led approach. And you'll have heard it before. And people would say not all constraints are created equally. And some constraints elicit a negative behavior rather than a positive behavior.
Sure.
So you'll put something in place and you'll go, oh, you know, that didn't work. And I know from my own personal experience, I'll apply a constraint and need to manipulate it 2 to 3 minutes afterwards because I'm like, okay, well that's not what this is. That's not what I'm looking to do here, and that's not what I'm hoping will emerge from this situation. So that for me is the key. But then on top of that, you still want them to become comfortable with their hands. So you want to figure out how do we manipulate a constraint so that hand techniques become a lot more frequent, but they don't overtake the emerging behaviors of what's going on. And that's where I think Adrian's content on, you're putting an emphasis on head kicks, but you're not constraining the session to head kicks.
Yeah.
You'll want somebody to start to develop patterns where they will emerge, but because you've put a beneficial element in them. So you could, in any sense, look at, in a free-flowing session, if you do get hit with a head kick, well, now you're only hands for the next 2 to 3 seconds. Or for the next 30 seconds, you have to work from a particular setting. Say you've gotten an axe kick onto the front leg, you now have to deal with a dead leg per se for that setting, and you can manipulate your session to create those contexts, but you can have it in the broader scheme of what you're doing. So the key pillars of what you're trying to do are maintained, but you just put a positive association with something you want to see emerge more frequently. Not in isolation, you don't want that to be the only thing, but you want it to just start to come through that a little bit more. So you create positive annotations to that particular technique. And that, for me, then, is when you actually see people create these fantastic, deceptive movements. And that's what I kind of wanted to come back to Adrian on, was that when you look at those sessions of creating a head kick being more beneficial, you see people start to almost base the opponent into moving the way they wanted to set up their kick. And I was curious if that's something you identify. You say, okay, I want you to, in the session, talking to a particular artist, say, I want you to create deceptive movements as much as you can to try and create this situation. And is that something you use? Is it something you don't use? And what's your kind of thoughts on that?
I think a huge thing that I would go to, sorry, I'm after kicking my laptop there. The huge thing that I go to would be, I don't like to introduce for a very long period of time. Like I like to set the nature of the constraint of the game very quickly and keep the conversations to as much as possible, talking with people individually in between, or if there's teachable moments, you know, in the matches themselves, like to do it there. But every now and again, you'll pull back out, you know, you'll pull the lens wide and let other people watch an example, or you'll have, you'll kind of draw on people to give an example of things that have worked for them, because you want them to reflect. So again, I suppose this philosophically comes down to whether, as you said, it's a perception action coupling type event, or it's more cognitively led in the kind of more game sense type of, you know, does the person actually, you know, cognitively process what it is that they're looking to do. And it, like for me, it's always a little bit of, it depends, you know, and, you know,
big time.
You want a reaction. You want the reaction to be appropriate. You want it to be practiced. You want a good decision to happen almost automatically. But at the same time, you want a person on a more aggressive side of things, or a more positive looking to score side of things, be able to go, well, this is the game state. This is what I want to do from here. This is the way my partner is moving. This is their rhythm. This is their facing. This is their stance. This is what they like to do. This is what I like to do. And all of that means together, hopefully with as much of that chunked as possible, you know, okay, so I do this next. My next movement is, my next action is, and that should come pretty naturally and quickly. And so part of it, we need to go back to the beginning, and or not to the beginning, but we need to go back and talk through, well, where were you when that happened? What, you know, why did that work? What did you see from the other side? Talk to the other person. Why did that work for them? You know, what were you seeing? How did it feel from your side?
I think there's a big balance there as well, like of getting that. And we've talked about this before, that the implicit information and the explicit information, in terms of like, you can recognize something subconsciously, but then you know that maybe you need to go about something just consciously, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think getting that balance as well, like you said, like you're probably picking up on cues and you're perceiving certain things subconsciously maybe, but then you also need that awareness to be able to like adapt consciously, because it's a short round of like 2 minutes, you know what I mean? You don't really have the luxury of going around and taking a break, a round off to have a like figure things out, especially 100%. In a live situation. You need that cognitive ability to actually adapt based on what you're perceiving implicitly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can use kind of elements of guided discovery in that, where if you want to highlight something in particular, you may get somebody to put on a bib and maybe put little circle targets on the bib, or you may put something on the side of the helmet, or you may identify markers on the hips that'll give away particular information about a particular kick source that little bit earlier. So if you highlight those areas and you give kind of a guided discovery element of just keep an eye on the red circles for the duration of that bout, and you're no longer telling them watch the way the hips move, because it's going to dictate what's happening. You're guiding their discovery towards hips, but you're not telling them what the hips are going to give them. You're just letting them explore. So if I do watch the hips, what's going to happen in this situation? Do I implicitly myself pick up any information from guiding my visual attention there? So you haven't explicitly told them what's going on, but you've guided their attention towards that. So you're still allowing them to implicitly learn what's going on without explicitly providing them information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely not something we've tried, or certainly that I've tried anyway.
Yeah, it's a good idea,
but not in that sense. I mean, guided discovery in general as a principle of teaching, sure, but it's certainly not in relation to that. Guiding the perception side of things is really interesting. Yeah,
and that would have been like a lot of my PhD work would have been on guiding the perceptual system, or guiding the visual attention to particular sources of information, not in huge detail, because again, you don't want to create too much restrictions on what you're allowing the person to see. But if we know that particular sources of information dictate performance, you look at a load of kids when they start sparring initially, as soon as you introduce foot pads, they all look at the foot because they're afraid they're going to get kicked and end up being punched in the head, because the whole of their attention is there guided downwards. So if you can bring that away from it in a way that you're not explicitly telling them what's going on, they're going to start to pick up on that information earlier. And then you can obviously scale that towards your higher level athletes, depending on what you want to see come out of that. Another thing that I did write down a second ago is when you were talking about your higher level athletes and creating consequence, and that your consequences had been an element of the person on the opposite side would lose their hands for 10 seconds. And while I thoroughly enjoyed that element of it, the research in creating anxiety has shown that it doesn't always have to be something within the actual setting. So it doesn't have to be representative of the actual game. So I was in Norway and Estonia recently, because I work with the senior women's basketball team. And after one of our games, our team kind of co-captains came and were like, look, our free throw percentage was poor. So we're like, yeah, completely agree. What would you like to do? They're like, we just want to work on some free throws work at the end of our training session tomorrow morning. Okay, no problem. And in that session, was like, you take it, you lead it, you do what you need to. So they came out and they were working on their free throws, nailing their 3 free throws. And it's kind of like, okay, well, you can all nail your free throws here. And you've asked yourselves to get whatever percentage it is. Why were you not making free throws in the game? And they're like, well, there's a lot of crowd noise. I'm like, okay, well, let's experiment with that. So I had a speaker with me and I just put on random buzzer noises as they're starting to shoot free throws. And that created an element of, well, that's annoying and that puts me off a little bit. So that's something that's an issue. But again, the emotive anxiety of, I'm on this line, I've got 2 free shots and everybody expects me to make them. And if I do make them, it's going to be beneficial to my team. If I don't, it's going to be something we look at afterwards. So how do we then as coaches create an anxiety behavior for them? So I said, something I had noticed, I kind of taken the piss out of a few of them based on the amount of time they spent on their phones between the bus trips and coming back to lunch. And I was like, okay, I'll make you a deal. You tell me what percentage you should make from the free throw line in training. And they're like, something like 68%. Like, okay, if you don't make that, I take your phones after the training session for the next 4 hours. And you can instantly see some of their faces drop. It's like, but this part of my hand, it only extends, it never leaves me. So you manipulate the order of who takes the free throws, because the stronger people will start and finish the session in those. So you say, okay, you go first, you go second, you go third. And you then say, okay, off you go. And then you see their faces as people start to miss. And the pressure starts to build on particular people. So you can schedule it so that people who had missed free throws in the game before are now at the point of the pressure situation. If they don't make their free throw, everybody loses their phone for the next 4 hours. And only because you can see that emotive, I'm not going to have my phone for the next 4 hours, you know that that's going to create a stress or an anxiety within them. It's still psychologically safe because they're going to get their phone back. It's not hugely negatively impacting them. So you go about that and that's fine. And what I did, they did not make it, so I took their phones for a period of time and it was fine. And we came back the night after. Free throw percentage increased, but it didn't get to the point where it really needed to be. Okay. You came back to us, you said you still wanted to work on it. Now I want you guys to create a consequence. Create a consequence that's not exactly representative of the game, but that will create that emotion, anxiety in you that's similar to how you are in the game. And the more you get to know your individual athletes, the way better those consequences become. I have particular athletes who hate choosing music for sessions. So they then will be told, you will pick music for the next 6 sessions based on whatever mark we've set out beforehand. And you can see it, you create that. It's the same as somebody who does not like public speaking. And as soon as they have to stand up on a stage and present to people, it's like that stressful anxiety comes in place, but it's not. And it's funny because you use stress and anxiety in those terms and now it's be very careful about how you use those terms.
Yeah.
But it's very much a safe space of, we're going to create anxiety with you because you're going to get it in the game, but we're going to create it here in this level. And that's something, and I know you guys know your athletes incredibly well. So if you can manipulate those constraints of those guys in sparring sessions, it's going to mirror the anxiety they will experience on a main stage in the middle ring. In European and world level, that's just not always there in the training session. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely easier for us to do that with the athletes in our own clubs than it is for, it takes a little longer to, get to know people at national team. There's always new people coming through. But it's quite an interesting one that, on one level, you just intuitively understand that the emotion of the situation or the anxiety around the situation doesn't have to be linked to the competitive reality. It can be completely separate things. And it'll affect you emotionally, it'll affect you physically in the same ways. But it's a different thing to introduce that as a manipulation or as a constraint around the training environment. So in some cases, we've done that. Like particularly concentration training for patterns and so on, where you introduce distractions and everything, but it's not always it's often very much just visual or auditory, whereas on an emotional 100%. Level it's different. It's a different thing.
And you do have to be very careful with how you use it. There's a very distinct line, but again, your human intelligence and common sense will very much give you the understanding of what's going on. Yeah.
Bit of ethics. Yeah. But it brings me to a different question though that I had. I bounced this one off Richie there yesterday, and it's like coming from the world that I operate in as well as a coach educator, and a challenge that we have, which Richie has seen and experienced firsthand as well, is then how do you go about educating coaches with the concept of a constraints-led approach as your, as your skill acquisition strategy, where by their very nature, coaches start off with a low level of experience of the game as a whole.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one observation that I've had for sure, and like we talk about this endlessly, is that the most difficult thing is if their understanding of the game is poor, the constraints are poor.
Yeah, 100%. Or yeah, and I've also experienced if the understanding of the game is high, but the understanding of constraints is poor.
Okay, yeah.
You also get the same effect.
We haven't gotten to that hurdle yet. We're still on the first hurdle. The understanding of the game is weak, therefore what do you set constraints around when you don't fully understand the game? So where do you then go to on a coach education strategic level to begin?
Yeah, that's probably one of the things I battle anytime I go into a setting. Maybe not always on the lack of understanding of the game, but a very distinct, well, this is how we've always done it, so this is how we're going to do it element.
Yeah.
But to come back to your understanding, them not understanding the game is very much talk to the athlete. Their ability to convey or to discuss with the athlete what's going on from the athlete's perspective will give them a lot of information. I think quite often coaches have this idea of they're the ones in charge, so they're the ones that have to dictate what goes on. Whereas if you give them the understanding that they can go to their athlete, because their athlete's going to have more information about their situation than the coach will ever have. At times, the coach will be able to see things the athlete can't, and that's
of course. Yeah.
That's the beauty of being able to be a coach and set an environment that challenges them in that. But if they don't have a full understanding of it, if this isn't exactly what you were referring to, then pull me back in on it. But if they're saying, well, I don't fully understand what's going on in terms of how this is happening, if they ask the athlete will be able to give them a little bit of, yeah, well, I do this because this, and I threw that technique because of that, and this came to me because of the situation I was in. And then you couple that with, okay, well, what was the purpose of the session you designed? What was the purpose of the game you designed? What were you trying to achieve? And then they'll say, well, we want to get them better at X, Y, or Z. Say, okay, why do they need to get better at X, Y, or Z? They say, well, because when they're in competition, they'll need it, essentially. And say, okay, talk to me about the competition. What's in the competition environment that dictates that? And they'll be able to ream off all really important things like timing, the interaction between it, knowing when to throw a particular technique. And then you'll bring them back to say, okay, how many of those things you've identified are present in your training session at the moment? And you should get a little bit of an aha moment of, oh, yeah, not a lot. So then you can bring them to, okay, well, if we want to manipulate constraints, how do we manipulate constraints to get those things present in your session? It doesn't always have to be a 10 out of 10 on the scale of representativeness, because you'll never work there. It'll always be an 8, a 7, a 6, 5, a 4, whatever it may be. But giving them the understanding of, well, this is starting with the end in mind over here. This is where we want to get to. How do we scale back to our training session to take elements of this that are representative and put them in our training session? And that's one way I've always kind of started that conversation, because that's a conversation, especially when you're in a coach education setting, that takes a lot of time. But the other thing in that is giving them the understanding that they need to get better knowledge of the game. Because if they don't have better knowledge of the game, it's going to be harder for them to manipulate constraints.
Yeah, based on like how you would have had sessions when you were back training and things like that, for a general class of, we say, maybe like 8, 9, 10-year-olds, yellow belt, green belt, that kind of level, where would you like to see like a general session go? We say an hour long session. We say the warm up is all done and all that. How would you like to see that time spent?
So are you talking about a sparring session?
Sparring session in particular,
Sparring. Okay. I would always start with maintaining the interaction. So no pads, but it's understanding distance gauge. So very easy thing is, we've always done shoulder touches and knee touches. I understood shoulder touches. I never understood knee touches. I never understood foot touches. Because we never, ever tried to go there. But I do enjoy the element of very light, 20% contact of tag, but Taekwondo tag, if that makes sense. So you can phrase it as tag because kids associate well with tag. So you can then give them okay, you're playing a one-on-one game of tag, but it's only touch tag. You can't hit the person heavily, but if you touch them with your foot, it's no touchbacks. They've got to go find another opponent. And you'll let them, it'll be madness, because I've done this before. It will be utter madness, and you'll have kids running around in circles and kids standing on their own looking around trying to figure out what they're doing or where they're supposed to be. That's where you use the coach and go, okay, you're over here, come on, over you go.
Yeah.
But if you start with the simple one-to-one interaction and you maintain tag if it's just hands because you want to put an emphasis on feet or whatever it may be, or you maintain emphasis on trying to tag with both hands, as soon as you've tagged somebody with both hands, you move on, that person stays. But they're now understanding that they've got to gauge distance, they've got to understand timing, and they're creating a database of knowledge themselves of that interaction. You can then scale that up a little bit, where you'll have a bit of a more free-flowing one-to-one. So you'll say, okay, I want you to throw, your job in this session is to throw 7 different techniques to try and just touch your opponent, very simply. And you can work on that very simply, and you change participants because you'll always have that different information coming towards them, so they're not always stuck with the same affordance, because people will show them different things, and then you'll scale that maybe up to a point of working with full pads on, or you could, and again I'll get to the point of flipping this entire thing on its head, but you'll get to the point of, okay, well, we're going to free spar now, and what we see from that free spar is going to dictate what we're going to do next. Now you may have a theme in mind for that session where you'll then constrain but reduce the amount of scaling that's going on in the free spar. So you'll highlight more points for a particular technique or more points for a particular set of techniques. And then you'll discuss, okay, well, what did we find from that? And kids will give you loads of information. You pull them in as a group and you ask questions without answering them. So you let them answer them and you let them show each other examples of how they try to solve that problem. And even starting to use those words of solving problems gives them the idea that they are solving problems. And then it's very much it depends on what I see, what information the kids give me, as to where you then lead that. That makes sense. And then to flip that on its head, you start with a sparring session and then just take it from, this was chaotic, it was brilliant, where do we go from here? If that makes sense.
Yeah, there's something of like a free play, practice, shaped play kind of thing to that, where, as you said, if you can have the flexibility in the session and you can have a good enough understanding of the principles rather than the steps and stages, or we'll say the formula, to where, right, let's see what we're seeing, what's the thing that's standing out today from the free play, where you then go, okay, we're going to focus on this in this way for a little while, and then we bring it back into something with a constraint or something with a bit more of a shape play kind of feel to it, and see how well it translates. Because I suppose the polar opposite, if you go right back to the beginning of our discussion, was we tended to have pads or whatever it was for 15-20 minutes. Now abrupt line, sparring gear gets on, and now we're sparring, and there was always just that almost like distinction or
disassociation.
It's like, well, we're going to stop for 3 minutes here in the middle and change activity. And I think mentally as well, that kind of, I know I was doing that, but that was with pads over there, and now we have sparring gear on, so we're going to spar over here, and that kind of, I don't think it ever helped that there was that whole even visual change. Like when we know about psychology, the fact that you go into an entirely different setting, you have different physical arrangements of the group, you have, everything about it changes when you put these gloves and foot pads on. So to not practice that is weird.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I know that the question is probably going to be coming up from anybody that's listening to this as well, is of like, how do you approach technique then? Like, of course, we talked about like technique not really existing, in terms of there's so many variables in it. When we say in one psychic, there's like so many variations of that. But I'm sure the question is going to arise of where does technique come into all of this?
Yeah, that's something that quite often you'll have to argue that one quite frequently. You get there, but how are they going to improve their technique?
That's why I want you to do that for me.
Nice, Richie.
Yeah, it's good. That is good. So for me, My background in Taekwondo, if you put me back on pads next week and get me working on technique for the next 4 weeks, I'll probably get pretty decent technique working on pads. You put me into a competition with one of you guys, I'm going to get my head kicked off me in 3 to 4 seconds. So the thing I would always go to on that is, obviously from a sparring setting, there is no one technique that's more appropriate than the other. It's based on the individual and what their body or their organism constraints have for them. So what can I do? You take like the soccer example of a gap between two players, and you're talking about Barcelona. Messi is more likely to dribble through the gap. Javi's more likely to pass through the gap, and Neymar, Suarez are more likely to shoot through the gap in a simple sense. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you were to take those three players and say, well, this is the gap we have, we're going to work on passing technique. You're stunting that element of it from them, if that makes sense. So the argument for technique being drilled in is one I've never fully understood, because you never ever have the opportunity to replicate it. And if somebody will say to you, well, they're not performing their psychic well in competition, so I do need to go back and we need to work on the technique of the psychic. The question then still comes back to me of, why wasn't it working? You could have a super fast psychic, but if you don't have appropriate timing in the sparring session, your psychic's never going to land. Mm-hmm. The place you want it to work should dictate how you train it.
Yeah.
It's like, it for me, it's funny because traditionally you'd have seen a lot of coaches say, we've worked on this for hours and we have drilled this technique and they just don't get it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, Mark O'Sullivan has a very good image in one of his slides. Oh, I taught my dog to speak. And his buddy goes, oh, well, and show me. I taught him, he didn't learn it.
Yeah.
Two completely different things.
Yeah. So
though the emphasis of overly working technique constantly, for me is it's a null and void, because simple hammering over and over again has been shown to be completely different on each one. So you have a nail in one place and you hammer it over and over again, but the movement is always different. And the environment is ever changing. You will never throw the same technique twice in a competition, ever. So why train technique over and over and over again? I'm not sure if that fully answers your question,
no,
but
definitely.
It's the basis of why I would suggest that technique is not the way to go.
And how would you approach maybe principles of technique that you would like to see, as in like not stepping on your side kicks and things like that? Would you approach it the same way? Try to teach it through the game?
Yeah, 100%. If you can gamify it, because especially when you look at this, the argument for teaching technique will often come in younger athletes rather than older athletes. Mm-hmm. And I think it very quickly comes back to what Adrian said earlier. It becomes very boring when you just do the same thing over and over again, and you get very good at doing the same thing over and over again. And quite often you'll see it where the engagement level is so low on the technique drill sessions because kids just don't enjoy it. It's just a repeat over and over and over again. So there's no enjoyment. There's no engagement. So they're not really learning anything because they're not being challenged. So like the element of challenge for kids has to be huge in that setting, but an enjoyable challenge. Because if you look at even research in maths, and you look at how kids in the USA are taught maths and kids in Japan are taught maths, and what they've shown is that children who are in Japan are challenged in maths class 40% of the time, whereas kids in the USA are challenged in maths class 3% of the time. And teachers in Japan will actually go out of their way to give them the wrong answers because the kids are in a setting of challenge where they're trying to solve a problem. So their ability to learn is way higher. So their measurement or their improvement or their ability to do maths is significantly higher in Japan. You take that back to the question you asked. If you want to work on particular elements of it, shape the environment so that it comes up that little bit more. The reason you'll turn your foot or the reason you'll perform particular type of psychic is because of what's coming at you.
So many other things that are kind of like variables and factors, like such as distance, timing, like you were saying as well. Yeah.
I think where some of it comes from, not all of it, because I know from a cross sport like perspective on this, the same question comes up from coaches of every sport, even where the sport is a single skill sport. I think one of the challenges that we've got is in Taekwondo, it's because you've got the various disciplines, and then you've got so many individually named techniques on the fundamentals and within the patterns, and almost all of the techniques we'll use in sparring, with some exceptions, have a named technique corollary that's somewhat like it in a traditional context. It's almost like, well, they have to be named, they have to have precise details, because they all have to be separated and kept siloed from one another, so that a walking stance isn't a low stance. No, they're different by precisely this much. That the L stance and the fixed stance are different by precisely this much. That a shoulder line, a center line, a chest line punch are different, because where the reality of it, when you bring in opposition, it makes all that irrelevant. Like none of that matters anymore. So I think one of the challenges that we have is when someone has to teach and the same skill acquisition strategy is not effective across the modality. So, you're going to have a very difficult time having, a guided discovery approach to pattern. No one is going to spontaneously discover movement.
100%. Yeah,
so
100%.
It's a different thing. You can't set a volume of constraints that brings you to moon move. It's a different thing. So in that way, we're a lot more like gymnastics, to where, okay, in gymnastics, the reason that a front double requires these movements and shapes is because, well, biomechanically, if you don't do that, you'll land on your head. But in Taekwondo, it's like, well, the reason that the side kick takes this particular form is because you'll have X amount of deductions if you perform it in pattern and grading that way. Whereas sparring is, in its own sense, it's much purer. There's no need for a side kick. The requirement isn't a side kick. The requirement is that you preserve distance, that you create movement, that you place a foot in contact with a scoring area. The requirements are far more simple and the shape that you take to get there, and everything about that shape is only defined by the interaction between the two people. What happens if you make a shape in your side kick that's much more a side rising kick? It's like, well, we can check it on the way up. We can make a step around it. We can close the distance on it better. Okay, well, how do I stop my opponent doing that? Well, I change the shape. I prepare it differently. I initiate it differently. I disguise the initiation. And I think that's where we have that kind of challenge for ourselves, where it's like, well, okay, you're brand new to this whole thing of coaching, and you've only just ever done what you were taught to do before, and that's great. But now we need you to discover several strategies of skill acquisition and learning. Good luck.
Yeah. And look, and that's the thing. It's harder. There's no beating around the bush. It is harder to apply this approach to coaching, and it takes longer. And people get frustrated with it, and quite often you'll come across coaches who are more interested in being heard than anything else, and that's a difficult thing. When I started doing this, and when I started coaching, because I've coached in a couple of different sports with this, the biggest thing for me was shutting up. Like, significantly, the biggest thing for me through learning how to implement this kind of approach was not talking, and just allowing the athletes to discover what was going on, and to be that little bit more explorative, and to, when needed, just dip in and out, but to just take a step back, allow the athlete to be the center. Like, we quite often talk about athlete-centered approaches and coach-centered approaches. For me, there's no argument in that. It has to be a athlete-centered approach. Your athlete has to take complete domain.
You have
of
to
what's
remember,
going
Alan,
on.
it's really hard to look like a genius if you're letting them do all of the creative.
And that's
especially when you have especially when you have a few degrees around your belt.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because there's culturally resilient beliefs in every sport you come across, and even when you look at what people are exposed to from like a martial arts perspective, heavily in boxing and heavily in UFC now, a lot of the montage videos are pads, and it's the really slick. it's glamorous. Like some of the Floyd Mayweather videos are like, don't get me wrong, they're outstanding.
Yeah.
But were they what made him a good fighter? I don't think so.
Actually, I was listening to Ricky Hatton talk about this last week on Sky Sports, and he said Floyd's father came in to coach him for one of his fights, and Ricky actually complained of over sparring, that he never sparred that much in his life. He was expecting to come in and just do all these pad work and learn all these flowing sequences and things like that. And Floyd Senior had him sparring almost every day, that he actually complained from not being able to recover. So I think that it's actually used like almost as like a way to set people up to believe that's how they train.
Hugely. There are so many people at the higher level who will just put things out there to confuse everybody else behind them.
Look at that, McGregor and Ido Portal.
You know? Yeah.
I mean, you can't believe that was a major part of McGregor's preparation for anything, you know?
Yeah, especially when you hear John Kavanagh speak the way he speaks at times about those about the sessions and the training that they typically divulged himself in. But it's interesting.
One thing there that I want to go back on, Alan, is that you did mention that this type of coaching is like more time consuming and can be more difficult and things like that. So what would you say to somebody who is the approach of, then why? Like, I've done it this way all along, the traditional way, and maybe I've produced some champions, and so why should I bother changing?
That
Again,
is
the last question that I want
question.
you to answer and get you in trouble with.
That's a brilliant question, and the go-to, the constant go-to for coaches at times is, well, look at my champions, look at the people who have done so well. And to coin, I think it was Mark O'Sullivan again, nobody sees the dead bodies. Nobody sees the amount of athletes who just faded away because of the coaching technique. The amount of, and I think he put it quite well, if I put 12 eggs in a bag and I chuck that bag at the wall and I pick out one egg that didn't break and go, oh, look, there's my process worked. For me, that's the same as having a group of 24 students and your technique works for one of them because they were resilient, they were robust, and they managed to almost, in spite of your coaching, get to the point they got to. And that's a very difficult one for people to hear. But when you take this approach, you are allowing every student that comes through your door the opportunity to explore and the opportunity to get better. And that's the big thing for me. That this is how we've always done it, and I've had success with it before. Argument has been proven through centuries as to why it's not right. We can all pick an individual who does a particular thing and got to that point. But it's very rare you can say, well, all of my students have an opportunity to explore and all of my students have an opportunity to develop and get better. That's what I would say to those people.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's something that Stuart from the Talent Equation kind of bases a lot on as well, isn't it? Like, of having more participation from people and actually keeping people in sport rather than just having a big conveyor belt coming through of starting off 100 people and you just end up with one guy who's on top of the podium.
That's a big thing.
I think that's pretty exciting. As I mean, for me, from someone who's been coaching for, you know, a long enough period of time as well, one of the reasons is, you know, do you want to go to coaching sessions where your job is the same every day? Like, that's, for me, that's very much like working in a production line or working down the coal mines. You know, it's like, it's not something that I would be excited every morning to wake up and go to, where the reality is when you come at it from the other approach, you don't know what you're going to learn. And what you learn every day is different for every day that you go out, because it's new people, it's new fresh faces, it's new ideas. They're tackling the same problems maybe, but they're coming up with different solutions because they're different people, which then challenge you to, you know, to find the right level of challenge, to find the right constraint for them, to find the right engagement, to help them learn this game in a way that suits them. And that's where coaching lives. That's where the relationships and stuff that coaching lives. If you had a process that you could just roll out again and again and again, it's like, great, trademark it, bottle it, whatever it happens to be, but no one has managed that. So there is more to it. And it's like everything, you know, it's if it's worth doing well, and it won't be easy. So
Yeah, it's like the idea of like having a cookie cutter system for a sport that's so dynamic and diverse. It doesn't make sense. Like, you know what I mean?
Cookie cutter coaching is cookie cutter, and copy and paste coaching is something that is prevalent in every sport you'll come into. Every sport you'll come into. But it's about people like you guys who are willing to go out of their comfort zone themselves and doing things that they're asking their students to do. You go out of your own, like it's a case of, I'm willing to go out and try and better my understanding of what's going on so I can help you do the exact same thing, rather than this is what I know, but I'm asking you to come up with something.
And you take a chance and you can look foolish, because I mean, again, if you put yourself out there and you show something and it doesn't work, or it doesn't immediately and apparently work, or the people observing it don't see the value, you know, you put yourself out there for ridicule. I mean, you know, you can get a certain amount of leeway if you have enough degrees on your belt, or if you are a PhD or whatever. You can buy authority in a way and give yourself a little bit of leeway that people might give what you're saying a chance. But it's very hard to, you know, if you got someone to come up and give us a demo of something, when I don't know how my athletes are going to get on with it. You know, I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if there's a way of breaking the game, or a scenario that I just haven't thought of yet that they're going to think of in 2 minutes, and I'm going to look like an idiot. You know, it's going to happen, and I have to be okay with looking like an idiot, or turning 100%. Around to the students going, all right, that one didn't work, let's try something else, you know.
But even that, you have to be open to be checked by your students. You have to be open to students going, this isn't working, and you're going, I actually, you know what, I think you're right, I don't think this is working. So talk to me. How can we get this better? How can we evolve this? How can we change this to get to where we want to go?
I think that all comes from the idea as well of, like, traditionally the coach knows best, like, isn't it? Whereas, like, it's almost like an ego thing of, because I said it, I'm afraid to abandon it now. I want to stick to my guns, kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's very much the I don't make mistakes, and everything I say is golden, which is just, you know.
The sooner you step down off that pedestal, the safer you'll be, you know? Because once you recognize that you're fallible, that you can make mistakes, you don't have to set yourself up for that big fall. You can adapt, and you can admit smaller mistakes earlier that stop you reaching that precipice of that ultimate mistake where you're totally disproven and, you know, it all falls apart. So,
but it allows your athletes, it shows your athletes, and it creates that environment for your athletes for them to know that it is okay to make mistakes. This is the place we make mistakes, because that's how we're going to learn. And it's not just you guys that are going to make them, I'm going to make them too.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a psychological thing as well, though, of like having that culture in your school or club or in your team, whatever, of like reaching the idea of perfection that doesn't exist, rather than, you know, having that high threat state involved with people where you know, they're really under pressure to make the correct decision all the time. But there's an acceptance there that it's okay to make mistakes, and it's actually part of the journey that we want to go along, to be able to learn from these mistakes and move forward, you know.
100%. Completely agree with you.
Sweet.
So yeah, there's been some great stuff there. So first of all, just thanks very much. I'm after taking loads from it. It's been very, very good.
Indulging our ramblings for nearly an hour and a half here. Fair play to you.
I think you indulged my ramblings more than me indulging your ramblings. But it's because it's like Taekwondo gave me a platform no other sport has at all, and I've had some people in Taekwondo who have given me more than any other coaches ever have. So it's something that I want to, at some point in time when I've got a little bit more free time, jump back into it, because it's, as a sport, it's fascinating. It is the interaction, the engagement, and its ability to reach kids that other sports just don't reach is phenomenal. So thank you for having me on as well.
We'll have to get you down for a session sometime.
Yeah, if by session you mean observe from the side, then fine. But other than that, my hips don't move at all anymore.
It's all right. You can go back to just hands. We'll be fine.
You can just coach it. You can just lead a session. It's fine.
Yeah. It's all right. Just stand at the side. Exactly. Happy days.
No, honestly though, thanks very much for doing it. It's been fantastic, and I'm sure there's going to be people that get a lot of value from this. So appreciate it very much.
Can't wait to answer the questions.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Look, if you've got any questions that come flying at you that you want to throw my direction, by all means do.
Super
Cool.
appreciate that.
Absolutely. Right. So I guess we leave it there, will we?
Excellent.
Cheers.
Brilliant.
Best of luck, everyone.
All right. Appreciate it, Alan.
See you, lads.
See you later.
Cheers.
Bye bye.